Welcome, friends. Sit back and relax and listen as Rupert reads another story. Today we are going to continue with The Adventures of Grandfather Frog by Thornton W Burgess, chapters 7, 8, and 9. Chapter 7. Grandfather Frog's big mouth gets him in trouble. Grandfather Frog has a great big mouth. You know that. Everyone does. His friends of the Smiling Pool, the Laughing Brook, and the Green Meadows have teased Grandfather Frog a great deal about the size of his mouth. But he hasn't minded in the least, not the very least. You see, he learned a long time ago that a big mouth is very handy for catching foolish green flies, especially when two happen to come along together. So he is rather proud of his big mouth, just as he is of his goggly eyes. But once in a while his big mouth gets him into trouble. It's a way big mouths have. It holds so much that it makes him greedy sometimes. He stuffs it full after his stomach already has all that it can hold. And then, of course, he can't swallow. Then Grandfather Frog looks very foolish and silly and undignified, and everybody calls him a greedy fellow who is old enough to know better, and who ought to be ashamed of himself. Perhaps he is, but he never says so, and he is almost sure to do the same thing over again the first chance he has. Now what happened that one morning when Grandfather Frog had had a very good breakfast of foolish green flies and really didn't need another single thing to eat, who should come along but Little Joe Otter, who had been down in the big river fishing. He had eaten all that he could hold, and he was taking the rest of the catch in the secret hiding place up the Laughing Brook. Now, Grandfather Frog is very fond of fish for a chance, and when he saw those that Little Joe Otter had, his eyes glistened, and in spite of his full stomach, his mouth watered.
"Good morning, Grandfather Frog. Have you had your breakfast yet?"
called Little Joe Otter. Grandfather Frog wanted to say no, but he always tells the truth.
"Yes," he replied. "I've had my breakfast, such as it was. Why do you ask?" "Oh, for no reason in particular. I just thought that if you hadn't, you might like a fish. But as long as you have had breakfast, of course you don't want one,"
said Little Joe, his bright eyes beginning to twinkle. He held the fish out so Grandfather Frog could see just how plump and nice they were.
"Chum!"
exclaimed Grandfather Frog.
"Those certainly are very nice fish indeed. It is very nice of you to think of a poor old fellow like me, and I might find room for just a teeny-weeny one, if you can spare it."
Little Joe Otter knows all about Grandfather Frog's greediness. He looked at Grandfather Frog's white and yellow waistcoat and saw how it was already stuffed full to bursting. The twinkle in his eyes grew even more mischievous than ever as he said,
"Of course I can, but I wouldn't think of giving such an old friend a teeny-weeny one."
With that, Little Joe Otter picked one of the biggest fish he had and tossed it over to Grandfather Frog. It landed close by his nose with a great splash, and it was almost half as big as Grandfather Frog himself. It was plump and so tempting that Grandfather Frog forgot all about his full stomach. He even forgot to be polite and thank Little Joe Otter. He just opened his great mouth and seized the fish. Yes, sir, that is just what he did. Almost before he could wink an eye, the fish had started down Grandfather Frog's throat head first. Now, you know, Grandfather Frog has no teeth, and so he cannot bite things in two. He had to swallow them whole. That is just what he started to do with that fish. It went all right until the head reached his stomach. But you can't put anything more into a thing that's already full. And Grandfather Frog's stomach was packed as full as it could be of foolish green flies. There the fish stuck, and gulp and swallow as hard as he could, Grandfather Frog couldn't make that fish go a bit further. Then he tried to get it out again, but it had gone so far down his throat that he couldn't get it back. Grandfather Frog began to choke. Chapter 8. Spotty the Turtle Plays Doctor. Greedy's a dreadful thing to see, as everybody will agree. At first, Little Joe Otter, sitting on the bank of the Smiling Pool, laughed himself almost sick as he watched Grandfather Frog trying to swallow a fish almost as big as himself. When his white and yellow waistcoat was already stuffed so full of foolish green flies that there wasn't room for anything more. Such greed would have been disgusting if it hadn't been so very, very funny. At least, it was funny at first, for the fish had stuck with its tail hanging out of Grandfather Frog's big mouth. Grandfather Frog hitched his way and hitched that way on his big green lily pad, trying his best to swallow. Twice he tumbled off with a splash into the Smiling Pool. Each time he scrambled back again and rolled his great goggly eyes in silent appeal to Little Joe Otter to come to his aid. But Little Joe Otter was laughing so that he had to hold his stitches. He didn't understand that Grandfather Frog was really in trouble. Billy Mink and Jerry Muskrat came along, and as soon as they saw Grandfather Frog, they began to laugh too. They had just laughed and laughed and laughed until the tears came. They rolled over and over on the bank and kicked their heels from sheer enjoyment. It was the funniest thing they had seen in a long time. "Did you ever see such a greed?" gasped Billy Mink. "Why, don't you pull it out and start over again?" shouted Little Joe Otter. Now, this is just what Grandfather Frog was trying to do. At least, he was trying to pull the fish out. He hadn't the least desire in the world to swallow it again. In fact, he felt just then as if he never wanted to see another fish so long as he lived. But Grandfather Frog's hands are not made for grasping slippery things, and the tail of the fish is very slippery indeed. He tried first with one hand, then tried with the other, and at last with both. It was of no use at all. He just couldn't budge that fish. He couldn't cough it up because it had gone too far down for that. The more he clawed at that wavering tail in his hands, the funnier he looked, and the harder Little Joe Otter and Billy Mink and Jerry Muskrat laughed. They made such a noise that Spotty the Turtle, who had been taking a sun bath on the end of the old log, slipped into the water and started to see what it was all about. Now, Spotty the Turtle is very slow on land, but he is a good swimmer, and hurried now because he didn't want to miss the fun. At first, he didn't see Grandfather Frog. "What's the joke?" he asked. Little Joe Otter simply pointed to Grandfather Frog. Little Joe had laughed so much that he couldn't even speak. Spotty looked over to the big green lily pad and started to laugh too. Then he saw great tears rolling down from Grandfather Frog's eyes, and heard little choking sounds. He stopped laughing and started for Grandfather Frog as fast as he could swim. He climbed right up on the big green lily pad and, reaching out, grabbed the end of the fish tail in his beak-like mouth. Then Spotty the Turtle settled back and pulled, and Grandfather Frog settled back and pulled. Splash! Grandfather Frog had fallen backward into the Smiling Pool on one side of the big green lily pad. Splash! Spotty the Turtle had fallen backwards into the Smiling Pool on the opposite side of the big green lily pad, and the fish, which had caused all the trouble, lay floating in the water. Thank you, gasped Grandfather Frog as he feebly clawed back to the lily pad. "A minute more and I would have choked to death." "Don't mention it," replied Spotty the Turtle. "I never will," promised Grandfather Frog. Chapter 9. Old Mr. Toad visits Grandfather Frog. Grandfather Frog and Mr. Toad are cousins. Of course, you know that without being told. Everybody does. But not everybody knows that they were born in the same place. They were. Yes, sir, they were. They were born in the Smiling Pool. Both had long tails for a while with no legs, and they played and swam together without ever going on shore. In fact, when they were babies, they couldn't live out of the water. And people who saw them didn't know the difference between them and called them both by the same names, tadpoles or pollywogs. But when they grew old enough to have legs and get along without tails, they parted company. You see, it was this way. Grandfather Frog, of course he wasn't Grandfather Frog then, loved the Smiling Pool so well that he couldn't think of leaving it. He heard all about the great world and what a wonderful place it was, but he couldn't and wouldn't believe that there could be any nicer place than the Smiling Pool. And so he made up his mind that he would live there always. But Mr. Toad could hardly wait to get rid of his tail before turning his back on the Smiling Pool and starting out to see the great world. Nothing that Grandfather Frog could say would stop him. And away Mr. Toad went. And when he was so small that he could hide under a clover leaf, Grandfather Frog didn't expect to see him again. But he did. though it wasn't for a long, long time. And when he did come back, he had grown so that Grandfather Frog hardly knew him at first. And right then and there began a dispute, which they have kept up ever since, whether it was best to go out into the great world or remain in the home of their childhood. Each was sure that what he had done was best, and each is sure of it to this day. So whenever Mr. Toad visits Grandfather Frog, as he does every once in a while, they are sure to argue and argue on the same old subject. It was so on that day that Grandfather Frog had so nearly choked to death. Old Mr. Toad had heard about it from one of the little merry breezes of Old Mother West Wind, and right away had started for the Smiling Pool to pay his respects to Grandfather Frog, and to tell him how glad he was that Spotty the Turtle had come along just in time to pull the fish out of Grandfather Frog's throat. Now all the day long, Grandfather Frog had to listen to unpleasant remarks about his greediness. It was sure a splendid chance to tease him that everybody around the Smiling Pool took advantage of it. Grandfather Frog took it good-naturedly at first, but after a while it made him cross, and by the time his cousin, old Mr. Toad, arrived, he was sulky and just grunted. When Mr. Toad told him how glad he was to find Grandfather Frog quite recovered, old Mr. Toad pretended not to notice how out of sorts Grandfather Frog was, but kept right on talking. "If you had been out in the great world as much as I have been, you would have known that Little Joe wasn't giving you that fish for nothing," said he. Grandfather Frog swelled right up with anger. "Jarum!" he exclaimed in the deepest, gruffest voice. "Jarum! Go back to the great world and learn to mind your own affairs, Mr. Toad." Right away, old Mr. Toad began to swell with anger too. For a whole minute he glared at Grandfather Frog, so indignant he couldn't find his tongue. When he did find it, he said some very unpleasant things, and right away they began to dispute. "What good are you to anybody but yourself, never seeing anything of the great world and not knowing anything about what is going on or what other people are doing?" asked Mr. Toad. "I'm minding my own affairs and not meddling with things that don't concern me, as seems to be the way out in the great world you are so fond of talking about," retorted Grandfather Frog. "Wise people know enough to be content with what they have. You've been out in the great world ever since you could hop, and what good has it done you? Tell me that. You haven't even a decent suit of clothes on your back." Grandfather Frog patted his white and yellow waistcoat as he spoke and looked admiringly at the reflection of the handsome green coat in the Smiling Pool. Old Mr. Toad's eyes snapped, for, his suit is very plain and rough. "People who do honest work for their lives have no time to sit in fine clothes admiring themselves," he replied sharply. "I've learned this much out in the great world, that lazy people come to no end, and I know enough not to choke myself to death." Grandfather Frog almost choked again. He was so angry. You see, Mr. Toad's remarks were very personal, and nobody likes personal remarks when they are unpleasant, especially if they happen to be true. Grandfather Frog was trying his best to think of something sharp to say in reply, when Mr. Redwing, sitting on the top of the big hickory tree, shouted, "Here comes Farmer Brown's boy!" Grandfather Frog forgot his anger and began to look anxious. He moved about uneasily on his big green lily pad and got ready to dive in the Smiling Pool, for he was afraid that Farmer Brown's boy had a pocket full of stones, as he usually did have when he came to the Smiling Pool. Old Mr. Toad didn't look troubled the least bit. He didn't even look around for a hiding place. He just sat still and grinned. "You better watch out, or you'll never visit the Smiling Pool again," called Grandfather Frog. "Oh," replied Mr. Toad, "I'm not afraid. Farmer Brown's boy is a friend of mine. I help him in his garden. How to make friends is one of the things the great world has taught me." "Charum," said Grandfather Frog. "I have, you know that." But what it was that he was to know Mr. Toad had never found out, for just then Grandfather Frog caught sight of Farmer Brown's boy, and without waiting to even say goodbye, he dived into the Smiling Pool. And that's the end of the read today, and if you liked what you heard, please consider liking, commenting, subscribing, and possibly sharing it with somebody you know. Thank you.